This is all about showing reviewers you can deliver. And we're going to concentrate very much on the method section today, sometimes called the research plan, but the research plan often does include the sort of background story. So we've made that distinction in our terminology. And this is all about how you can make your method section really good. It's about how you work with your methodological collaborators to come up with a really good, well-written section that will be reviewer-proof. So I thought I'd start with a kind of overview of the method section to begin with, and the sorts of things that reviewers will be looking at. So you will remember the 4 key propositions that I talked about yesterday. Obviously, the method section is all about demonstrating that the project can answer the question, that the success proposition. So if we do this work, we will answer the question that we've posed ourselves. So if we think about the method section, I suspect many of you, certainly those, I think we've got about half who've put in grant proposals before, will be very familiar with the kinds of methods sections that you see. So obviously there are issues relating to design, so the specific design that's being used. The setting, of course, this would be a very nice setting for most of us, but in fact, we end up mainly in these sorts of places. I did have a colleague once who had a sister who was doing a PhD on dolphins in Bermuda or something. I thought that was a fantastic PhD to do, but most of us end up in these sorts of settings for our research. Your sample, so, you know, who you're gathering information from, and the sampling frame or technique that you're using. So how, not the sampling frame, the technique that you're using to sample, whether it's snowball sampling, whether it's a random sample, etc. If there's an intervention, what it is, and indeed what its comparator might be. Sources of data, so where are you getting your data from? The sort of outcome measures that you are using, the data analysis methods that you're using, and sort of aspects of project planning. So these are all the sorts of things that we'd expect to see in a method section. So study design, details of randomization, allocation, blinding if it's relevant, setting, sampling and recruitment, intervention and comparator if relevant, data collection, outcome measures, data analysis and project management. So what do reviewers care about? Well, the primary thing they're looking for is, will the methods proposed answer the research question? Will we actually have something at the end of the day that addresses the problem that you've posed? And are these methods appropriate to what you're doing? Are they scientifically rigorous? So these obviously relate to whether they'll answer the question. Are they feasible? So are you trying to do something unrealistic, or actually are they feasible? You know, are the data actually there? Is the information that you need really there? You may have a massive data set and it may have lots of variables, but how accurate are those variables? I mean, are variables missing? And at the end of the day, will these methods deliver useful outputs? And reviewers need sufficient detail to gauge all this. And it's very difficult in grant applications, I think, to balance that level of detail that was satisfying reviewers with the word counts that you're faced with in grant applications. So just a little literary interlude. You don't want this. So you don't want a wonderfully written grant proposal that in fact can be blown down by a reviewer with just one puff. They take one look at it and say, well, the methods aren't going to address the problem. So it's just not reviewer proof. What you're after is a nice, secure method section that no matter what scrutiny a reviewer gives it, they can't punch a hole in it. It's important, I think, to demonstrate your thinking. So remember that funders don't usually interview. If they do, it's pretty much down the line after you've been through remit checks and stage 1s, etc. So it's important to answer all the questions that might bubble up in their heads in your written application. And if you remember yesterday, we talked about giving reviewers what they need when they need it. So when that question bubbles up in their head about a method that you're doing, you pretty much mitigate it with one of your defensive arguments, so they don't have to worry about it anymore. So it's important not to skate over the potential pitfalls or problems with your research. We know that there's no perfect research method. There'll always be some compromise along the way, but it is important to show that you are aware of the shortfalls of any approach that you're taking. So you need to preempt the criticism and confront it, not ignore the problem and hope that reviewers don't notice it, because they're all very experienced researchers in their own right and they will pick up on issues. So do acknowledge weaknesses and remove them or mitigate them where possible. And we had some examples of defensive arguments yesterday. It's worth discussing strengths over alternative approaches in terms of study design and methods, especially if they are perhaps not the immediately obvious design or method that you're hoping to follow. And there will be some methods, for example, in public health, we have things like community participatory action research, we have systems research that perhaps a traditional funding panel may not know about. Or may know of, but not fully understand. And therefore, it's important that you give the rationale for adopting a particular method if it's either something that people won't be familiar with, or it's not the immediately obvious design that you come for in a particular situation. So let's talk a little bit about study design and the sorts of questions that reviewers might come up with in relation to study design. So what will reviewers ask? Well, the first thing they will ask is the design clear? Is it clear what design you've adopted for your research? Is it a randomized control trial? Is it a descriptive study? Is it an observational study, a case control study? Will the design answer the research question? So is it an appropriate design for the question being posed? Has a clear rationale been provided for the study design? Now, sometimes that might be quite obvious. If you're comparing two things, your first stop shop might be a randomized control trial, but there may be reasons why you can't do that, or it doesn't make sense. But make sure there's a clear rationale, whatever. Are the theoretical underpinnings of the design suited to the nature of the question? And this is something that a qualitative researcher might well ask. What are the relative strengths and weaknesses of the approach that you're adopting? How does the design compare to alternatives? So related really to the rationale for the study design that you're using. Is it the best? Is there another way of doing it? Have the researchers consulted appropriate methods experts? Of course, that can operate at several different levels. If you have a large section of your work is statistical or qualitative, you would expect to have more than a consultation with a methods expert. You'd really want them to be on board with your project as a collaborative or collaborator or co-applicant. Obviously, you can consult methods experts at the development stage, but if it is a substantial part of your study, you should have people on board with the skills to carry through the research. Have patients, service users, carers, and relevant other stakeholders been involved in the design? Again, the National Institute for Health Research, as you know from yesterday, and you'll learn more about tomorrow, are really, really keen to see patients and service users and carers involved in the research at the application stage and throughout the research process. And obviously there are other stakeholders such as NHS staff and other people who may be policymakers, managers, depending on the project that you're undertaking, who should be involved and have contributed to the design and agreed in a way that this is a good approach. Might there be any practical implications in attempting to implement the study? So, well, we'll come across a few as we go through, but, is it really logistically possible to do what you're suggesting? What methods are used to ensure rigor? So, are you adopting, more than one approach to show that, something is happening? So where relevant, is there any chance of contamination between intervention and control arms? So if you have perhaps a nursing-based intervention based on the two wards and you've got control wards, are staff actually flitting between wards and bringing what they've learned on one ward to another ward? Because it may mean that rather than an individual randomized control trial, if that was your chosen approach, you might have to have a cluster trial or another type of design, a natural experiment that using wards from different hospitals. The latter, of course, are very complex because confounding is a massive issue. And again, are relevant confounders accounted for? So those variables that are going to affect your outcomes of interest, but aren't actually directly related to the intervention that you're trying to evaluate. things like age and sex and socioeconomic class, things that are going to influence the results and can kind of confuse your outcomes in relation to the intervention that you're interested in. Is the randomization procedure suitable? So, we now have quite sophisticated ways through clinical trials units of randomization. Is it suitable? Is a clinical trials unit on board? Now, that obviously isn't necessary for every study. There are some funders and certain funding streams that like to see CTUs. If you're doing a clinical trial of an investigation medicinal product, you certainly will need a CTU on board. And certain other funding streams, things such as HTA, probably do want a clinical trials unit on board. These are organisations who will take on board a lot of the management of this sort of statistical side of the work that you do, and indeed the management of the trial. And they have varying degrees of involvement. And sometimes, you can buy a sort of package from them, which might involve randomization. Others may take on board everything, including the data analysis, etc. Again, another qualitative question, and hopefully if you've got a question about this, you can direct it to one of my qualitative colleagues. But what is the ontological and epistemological position of the work important if you're undertaking qualitative research? And similarly, in qualitative research, and indeed actually with other types of research too, because if you don't understand the culture of the participating organisation, you may find that you're imposing something on them that doesn't work in terms of research, but also very important in qualitative research. Does the design use more than one method of data collection to facilitate cross-checking or triangulation findings? So referring back to this idea of rigour, and making sure that what you're seeing is reinforced by other approaches. So you often see that in sort of mixed methods research. Are there any ethical issues in relation to the design that need consideration? Now, obviously, there are ethics committees, and you submit an ethics proposal, protocol to ethics committees, and they should deal with the ethical aspects of the study. But if there are any obvious ones, reviewers will comment on them. If there are specific issues, for example, that they feel PPI should have more input into, or that an ethics committee should take note of, they will look at that. So bear those in mind. A few examples of study designs that might cause problems or might raise issues. So if someone were doing a descriptive study examining the health beliefs of people based only on a quantitative survey, a question that a reviewer might come up with is, well, we'll have a lack of insight there. We really need some qualitative work. We're looking at health beliefs. A quantitative survey is likely to be quite superficial. An RCT involving sham surgery. Well, an obvious question is, will patients actually agree to take part? An intervention running 2 hospital wards compared to 2 control wards in the same hospital. And I mentioned this earlier. Will intervention and control groups become contaminated? I.e., is a cluster trial perhaps more appropriate? A study of a nurse-patient interaction where patients are consented before and interviewed after the interaction of interest. One can imagine that the researchers may influence the intervention itself, so the Hawthorne effect. If you've got a really nice research nurse, you may not in your mind disentangle them from the person delivering the intervention. Before and after study of an intervention to reduce allergens in the home, the reviewer might ask, are there seasonal patterns that will influence the outcome? And a quasi-experiment of an intervention in one site compared with a control site, what would you ask? I mean, the biggie would be, are there systematic differences between the sites affecting outcomes? In fact, it's exceedingly difficult, for example, to match hospital wards, even if they're within the same hospital, then you run the risk of contamination. So there are lots of swings and roundabouts when it comes to study design that need to be considered. What about sampling and recruitment? So the nitty-gritty of sampling and recruitment, the sorts of things on population, setting and location, sampling method, sample size, eligibility criteria, recruitment, consent. So what sort of questions might reviewers ask? Firstly, does the stated population and setting relate sensibly to the research question? Are sampling methods clearly stated and consistent with research objectives? Is the sample size clear? And you can be sure that there will be a reviewer who will check your sample size calculation if it's statistical. They'll want all the information they need in order to check that sample size calculation, and we'll be talking about what you need later. But similarly, with a qualitative study, you do need to say how you're sampling, whether it's a per posted sample or maximum variation sample, and also a rough idea of how many you may recruit. Obviously, with qualitative research, issues are different, so you might be looking for data saturation, but you'll have a rough idea probably of how many you would need to achieve that. Is the sample size justified on a theoretical and statistical basis? So building on what I've just said. What are the eligibility criteria? So what are your inclusion and exclusion criteria for this study? And some justification if it's not obvious. How, when, and by whom will eligibility criteria be applied? So is there some sort of screening that happens first? And if so, how and where does that happen? Is the process of accessing, approaching, consenting, and enrolling potential participants ethical and suitable? And so massive issue, getting that right and being very clear about when it will happen. Is recruitment likely to meet targets? And we'll see tomorrow how incredibly important that is and how often studies fail to actually reach their recruitment targets for various reasons. Have patients, carers, and service users been consulted about the recruitment process? This is tremendously important, Had issues relating to equality, diversity, inclusion been addressed? A very big issue now with the NIHR. They would really rather see you spend some of their money on ensuring EDI than ignoring it or saying, no, we've got to have people who only speak English in our study. So they'd rather see you spend resources on outreach and making sure that research is equally accessible to everybody. So some examples of where reviewers might come up with things. A study comparing two treatments with an N of 20. Well, an obvious query would be, you're going to need a bigger sample, and we must see the proper sample size calculation. A study looking at barriers and facilities to quality improvement, interviewing only patients and nursing staff. It's good that you're interviewing those, but in fact, there will be other key stakeholders, for example, managers in hospitals who may want to involve with that. A study of a rare disease in only 3 sites. Well, an obvious question is we need details of the prevalence, and it's likely that you're going to need more sites. In fact, if it's a very rare disease, you're probably going to have to include patients from abroad. A study looking at access to healthcare that has no plans to recruit non-English speakers. Well, you need plans for outreach, interpretation, and translation. A study of carers of people with dementia. So you need a clear process for how eligible people will be identified and consented. A study hoping to provide results to influence practice nationwide based on one rural general practice. So give me a few things that you might ask as a reviewer if you were presented with that as a recruitment strategy. I think obviously, is it representative of practices nationally? If you're only gathering information from one practice and then you're going to try and extrapolate your results and make them generalizable to other practices elsewhere or the health service elsewhere, you have to ask yourselves, is this really a good way to do this? And we need to actually have more representative practices. Now, not all studies will have an intervention, but if you do have one, there are things that you need to consider, and that is actually what you're doing, and also what the comparator might be. So some questions that reviewers might ask. Is the intervention clearly described? Actually, it's amazing how many applications you look at where the intervention isn't clearly described. Sometimes, there's a co-design process going on and you may not necessarily know what the ultimate intervention will look like, but even then it's helpful to let reviewers see the sorts of things that it might be. Is the intervention novel? I mean, research is all about pushing the frontiers of knowledge and novelty at the end of the day. So is this intervention actually new and interesting enough to evaluate? What is the current evidence to support it? So, we do need some information that tells us this is a sensible intervention that's being offered here. And usually that would be the form of prior work of some sort. Does it make sense for the group of interest? So, you know, will it work? What is the rationale for the dosing schedule? So you may say, well, we're going to do this for 3 months, or we're going to do an hour's worth of this intervention over a 6-month period. Well, why? You know, why? What makes you think that will work for a patient? Is the timing of the intervention clear? What is the likelihood of the effect relative to other factors? So, for example, you've got a, I don't know, a ward-based intervention, say a quality intervention, perhaps working with nurses to develop standards, to perhaps improve an aspect of care. How likely is that to impact on the patient compared to everything else that's going on with them? If you're looking at the work statistically. So you have to ask yourself, you know, what is the likely impact of the intervention relative to other factors? Is the chain of causation clear to be seen? And quite often you see projects providing things like a logic diagram, so you can see in more detail how they think the intervention will impact in the way that you want it to on patients. Have the researchers considered the implications for the NHS? So again, sadly, we work in a resource-constrained environment. So if you say, well, I've got a fantastic intervention, people do this every day, they're guided one-to-one by a nurse, and it goes on 365 days, people will immediately turn around and say, not in this NHS. So you have to think about whether there are implications to the NHS of the intervention. Also, you know, just fitting in with pathways. So it may be that, you know, you're trying to fit something in with other things that are happening in the NHS just to make it easier to do. Can the intervention be applied properly and consistently? So, you know, if you're asking different people to deliver the intervention, can we be sure that they'll do it in a similar way, fidelity to the intervention? Can health and social care professionals administer it? So you're asking them to do it. Can they do it? Is staff training adequate? So if they're going to deliver an intervention, have you got provision for that? Will staff be happy to administer the intervention? So not only can they do it, but are they happy to do it? And of course, stakeholder engagement early will help you solve or answer that question. Are staff experiences or preferences an issue? And that can lead to all sorts of issues, even in relation to study design. How will fidelity be ensured? As I said, how you can make sure that things are being delivered in a standard way. Will patients, carers, service users be happy to do it? So have you consulted with them? Do they think it's a good idea? Will participants adhere to the intervention? Is the comparison group well described and sensible? And obviously it's quite difficult sometimes to come up with a comparison group. People often use usual care, but then there's, you know, what on earth is usual care? It can vary sometimes in different NHS trusts. To what extent do we have to standardise that, or can we just be really pragmatic and accept what's there? Is blinding or placebo necessary or possible? Are there any ethical issues in relation to the intervention? And some examples of where a reviewer might pick up on things. A study using an evidence-based CBT intervention for a new group of patients. I think there might be some question over the novelty of that. You can justify it, you know, if you've got a good reason for thinking that a new type of patient may have issues or special needs in relation to an already tested and tried intervention, then, you know, it may still be worthy of research. But I think you'd have to demonstrate that that was necessary. People may just think it's not novel enough. The iterative development and testing of a training pack for nurses to help carers with patients with a long-term condition. Is the trail of causation clear and convincing? There are quite a lot of hoops for that intervention to go through to get through to the patient. The study of an exercise package for patients with multiple sclerosis to be delivered over 6 months. You would ask, why the specific package? Why over 6 months? What is the dose and the rationale for the dose? And are we likely to get long-term fidelity to that intervention? An RCT of a novel surgical technique. Well, there are issues with surgical trials. Firstly, is there evidence to support the technique? Is there evidence that surgeons can use the technique? quite often with new surgical techniques, there needs to be a run-in period so surgeons can become adept at it before it's actually evaluated. Evidence that it's actually at the right stage, therefore, for example, the randomization and that kind of design. Consideration of the ideal framework, and you'll find that there are a lot of different frameworks for research that help you get down what needs to be got down, or help you think through the things you need to think through. The ideal framework is something that's used for surgical studies. A study of a new drug for children with considerable behavioural side effects. Well, an obvious question is, will parents and patients be willing to adhere to the treatment? What about a comparison of an intervention with treatment as usual? What might come up in your mind if you were confronted with that as a reviewer? What is treatment as usual? And it's a lot more difficult than you think to define that. So let's think a little bit about data collection. What reviewers will ask, is it clear what types of data are being collected? And again, it's amazing how many people say, oh, we'll collect this, but they don't really say how, or they don't question whether the variable that you want to use in a big data set, for example, actually really relates truthfully to what you're looking for. Are the data types appropriate for meeting the research objectives? Is it clear what data collection methods are being used? So not only the types, but also how. Is it clear who will collect the data, where, and from whom? Are the data being collected at sensible times in relation to what is being examined? So sensible times in relation to the intervention and follow-up. Is data collection sensible in relation to NHS structures and pathways? So you'll find that a lot of researchers, as long as it makes sense for the intervention that they're looking at, will perhaps try and time those data collection episodes when a patient happens to be coming in for a follow-up appointment. So you don't have to have an additional work for the patient to take part in the study. Have other potential options been considered? So are you, collecting the right sort of data? Are there other things that you can collect? Are potential weaknesses of approaches identified and addressed? So, how perfect is that variable? Is data collection feasible? Again, have ethical implications been considered? Will missing data or poor quality data be an issue? The first thing a reviewer will ask when they're looking at big data studies, for example. Yeah, if big data also are permissions and timelines accounted for. So, it could take a while to get your slice of CPRD, you can practice research data link if that's what you're using. And of course, these things cost money. Oops, sorry. Is the data collection process acceptable to patients, carers, service users? Is blinding necessary or feasible? Is sufficient expertise available to ensure data of suitable quality? So again, this is where clinical trials can be invaluable, because they have protocols and SOPs to make sure that the data quality are good. So some examples of studies and the things that the reviewers might ask: a prognostic study examining risk factors for knee osteoarthritis using a routine database. Well, they might ask, are all important risk factors found as reliably recorded in the database? Will researchers have access to data in time for the study start? A study of risk factors for respiratory allergies using combined data from more than one routine data set. Can the data be standardized across data sets? Can you actually combine them and analyze them together? Mixed staff and patient focus groups to explore implementation of a new multidisciplinary intervention in an NHS rehabilitation setting. Will patients in different staff disciplines and grades be happy to share thoughts in mixed groups? And indeed, when you're doing qualitative research, there are different techniques that you can use. You can use focus groups, but you can also use semi-structured interviews, and sometimes semi-structured interviews are better if they're sensitive information being discussed, and focus groups are more appropriate to other sorts of things. And if you are having focus groups, will certain members of that group repress other members of that group? Will people be happy to talk freely if their boss is in the room with them? An intervention study requiring working age patients to attend hospital daily in the morning for a blood test, or will patients be able to attend clinics that regularly? Have you done sufficient PPI to show that actually that will work? Or are they all saying, well, no, that's far too punishing a schedule for us, so we're going to have to do something different? A survey of health and lifestyles using smartphones for data collection. I don't know whether you can think of anything that you might ask in relation to that as a reviewer. One issue would be issues of digital poverty and whether that's actually been considered, and not only digital poverty, as you pointed out, people not necessarily knowing how to use a smartphone even if they have it. And also, I think issues of obviously cybersecurity and the data security is something that you'd have to make sure is safe. Lots of other issues, I'm sure, as well. Okay, outcome measures. So what will reviewers ask about your outcome measures? So firstly, are they appropriate for the research question? A very obvious thing to ask. Are the measures relevant, appropriate for the patient service use of care as staff group of interest? Are you using a measure, developed for one group of patients with another group of patients, but perhaps they haven't got validity and reliability for? Are the outcome measures acceptable to patient service users, carers and staff? And sort of not only what they are, but burden of them, how many of them are you using? But yeah, are the measures valid and reliable? So, have they undergone, especially certain types of outcome measures that perhaps scored up, have they undergone rigorous validity and reliability checks? Is the rationale for particular outcomes made clear? So why you're using a particular outcome, especially if it's not the obvious one. Are outcome measures sensitive to the intervention being evaluated? So are you going to have floor or ceiling effects that will mean your data analysis would be pretty meaningless? Do proxy measures where used correlate well with outcomes? Sometimes you can't get to the outcome you really want and use a proxy measure. Well, is it good enough? Are the outcome measures properly referenced? So if a reviewer wants to look them up, or it's an odd outcome measure they're not heard of before, they can check reliability and validity, but preferably you would go into that so they wouldn't have to look anything up. Where relevant, is there a clear primary outcome? So usually we're looking for a clear primary outcome, quantitative type study. Where relevant, are outcome measures sensibly timetabled in relation to the intervention? So some examples: a study using an activities of daily living measure for patients who are unable to walk. Well, an obvious question is, will the ADL measure be sensitive enough to pick up the things that we're looking for? The comparison between two different interventions using an outcome measure derived from two others. Well, little red flags would pop up about how valid and reliable this measure would be, especially if it's scored up. Or you're sort of scoring up your own questionnaire that can have issues of validity and reliability. A study using a tool developed for adults in a paediatric ward. Well, how valid and reliable will this measure be for children? A study requiring patients to have 2 extra biopsies for histological assessment. Well, how acceptable would that be to patients? Using length of stay as a primary outcome in a study of a nursing quality intervention aimed at reducing pressure sores. What sort of questions might that generate in your head if you were a reviewer? This sort of study is a bit of a nightmare. But it is possible, but it is a bit of a nightmare. Some of these things are really difficult to do. But I think one obvious thing is sort of length of stay, as your primary outcome, which we know is affected by so many other things, such as bed blocking and availability of social care generally. Is it a sensible primary outcome measure? Okay, on to data analysis. What sorts of things will reviewers ask? Well, will the analysis help achieve the aims and objectives? Are the proposed methods suitable based on the type of data collected? Are the proposed methods suitable based on the sampling approach? So maybe theoretical issues there. How will the data be prepared for analysis? Now, people can use all sorts of data for their studies. It might be, a reading, when I did my PhD, I used thermohygrograph readings. How do you translate a line of data literally produced on a chart into data chunks that you can use in an analysis? Is the analysis plan clear and thorough? Are appropriate guidelines or references highlighted? Like in all aspects of research, there are often guidelines to help you structure, how you are reporting, etc. And it's worth looking to see what's relevant to your situation. Is specialist methodological input required? And again, the degree of that, and if you need it seriously, then you need a collaborator. But reviewers will definitely want to see that it's there. Is blinding necessary and feasible? And as you see, blinding can occur at several different stages in your research. Does the analysis take into account confounding variables? So you can design out some confounding through randomization or stratification, but at the end of the day, there's likely to be residual confounding. Are you dealing with that in some way, for example, in a regression model or some other statistical technique? Some examples: a randomized study comparing new and current treatment to bowel cancer based on percentage cancer-free at 6 months as primary outcome. Well, a statistician might ask you, would progression-free survival be preferable as a primary outcome? And does the analysis account for stratification factors? A study comparing outcomes at 1, 3, 6, 9, 12, etc. months post-randomization. Does the analysis suitably account for repeated measures over time? An interpretive phenomenological analysis to explore how participants experience the intervention. So is such a theoretical approach required to answer the question, or is there another approach that might be more appropriate? A natural experiment comparing the outcomes of a new exercise intervention for patients with COPD, running in one trust compared with standard care in another. This sort of thing might you ask. An obvious one being, will the potential confounding variables be accounted for in analysis? And it would be quite difficult to do that. Project management, issues such as sponsorship, governance, ethics, management and advisory structures, data management, intellectual property, timeline and milestones. We'll say a lot more about project management tomorrow, but just to give you a reviewer's view broadly on this, the sorts of questions they might ask: is sponsorship appropriate, and is it clear that ethics and governance principles can be upheld? Are all other relevant permissions and approvals in hand? And different sorts of research require different sorts of approvals, clinical trials, or if you're using animals, for example, which NIHR don't fund in their funding schemes, but other funders do. Is the proposed work feasible in the time allocated? Are the stages of this study in a sensible order? So if you've got work packages that inform each other, are they sequential? Are there other work packages that can be run in parallel? Has the researcher given themselves enough time and funding for each step? Do they have the right researchers in the right place at the right time? Have they got the right materials, equipment, and space they need? How will data be entered and managed? Do the arrangements for transcribing and storing interviews and focus groups meet the criteria for data protection? Have all quality assurance issues been considered properly? Have researchers considered the logistics of sample transport and storage, if that's relevant? Do researchers have freedom to operate? So that's an IP issue. You know, are they using someone else's intellectual property that needs to be sorted out? Do Gantt charts and flow charts make sense? Have they got the support of other relevant organisations? Overall, will the project be well managed, and will it deliver at the end of the day? Thinking again of the success criterion. Some examples: so 1 month set aside to obtain NHS approvals, ethics approvals. A question might be, will the study fall behind schedule immediately, and have time to actually do the recruitment analysis and dissemination? A study of people with severe mental health difficulties, have consent procedures been thoroughly considered with reference to appropriate ethics and other guidance? A study examining MRI images of the brain taken monthly over 6 months in 30 patients. Is access to the MRI planned appropriately and agreed? An RCT followed by a qualitative sub-study. Could the two run alongside together if there's no reason not to do that? A home-based physiotherapy intervention involving 100 patients and data collection over 3 weeks. Is this logistically possible? Is the research delivery network involved, because they can help with consenting patients and identifying sites, etc.? A clinical trial to evaluate a repurposed drug for a new patient group. Have MHRA costs and permissions been considered? That's the Medicines and Healthcare Products Agency. Have a research agency, have researchers, get the acronym right tomorrow. Have researchers considered suppliers, packaging and placebo? Do they have a CTU involved? Is the pharmacy on board? Is there a data monitoring and ethics committee? A study involving the regular collection of tissue samples. So have storage and transport issues been considered? Have issues relating to the Human Tissue Act been considered? When I asked an R&D lead about this, she said people never, ever budget for fridges They must have a fridge to store their samples in. A study developing a new device for taking biopsies. So what would you ask? So are there measures in place to capture intellectual property? Are appropriate regulatory requirements being addressed?